Just over 70 years ago, all of this was threatened with destruction. In the war of annihilation Adolf Hitler was waging against the Soviet Union. But the defenders of Leningrad would find the strength to resist in unexpected places, including a concert hall.
We're about to listen to one of the most extraordinary pieces of orchestral music ever written. Extraordinary not just because of the music, but because of the circumstances in which it was conceived.
It's the work of Soviet composer Dmitri Shostakovich, and it was performed here in the Philharmonic Hall in Leningrad, a city under siege that Hitler had vowed to destroy by bombs and shells, but principally by starvation.
Наступление голода, это было очень страшно. Там они бомбили, а вот что голод.
Ну, с людьми было, что они умирали, просто их собирали на санках, заворачивали в тряпки и на санках везли в общую свалку.
Here's another wrapped corpse being hauled by two men to be buried, but alongside is the body of a woman just abandoned.
But while Leningrad starved, Shostakovich's symphony crossed continents and oceans, uniting audiences around the world in their struggle against a common enemy.
This is the BBC Home Service. It is fitting that this work should receive its first performance in this country on the anniversary of Germany's treacherous attack on Russia.
And then, against the odds, the symphony returned to the besieged city, and musicians, some of them literally brought back from the dead, defied Hitler by giving the performance of a lifetime. This is a piece that makes superhuman demands on any orchestra. But a symphony written for half-starved musicians to play, it ain't. The symphony is going to be performed now in the same hall where it was played at the height of the siege. The conductor is Maxim Shostakovich, the son of the composer. As a 3-year-old, he was evacuated from the besieged city.
And alongside us are a precious handful of siege survivors and eyewitnesses to the birth of the symphony and to that historic performance just over 70 years ago. The Leningrad Symphony is a microcosm of the city in those desperate times, a monument to its suffering, heroism and survival.
It's a work that shows that when death is on the march and destruction is all around, art can be a weapon, a shield, a lifeline.
It's not surprising that a piece of music that made history should have come from this place, St. Petersburg, or Leningrad as it was called in the days of the Soviet Union. It was built as a showcase of Russian culture, with museums and concert halls, cathedrals and theatres. But when war came, these very same landmarks would be used by German artillery to range their guns and pinpoint targets in a city that stood for everything that Adolf Hitler hated. And yet somehow, in the midst of all the destruction, the cultural heart of the city continued to beat. To understand how that happened, you have to understand something about the city itself.
Most great cities evolve over centuries, but St. Petersburg was willed into existence in a single generation at the behest of one man, Peter the Great, to make an epic political, economic and cultural statement. Resounding statements have issued from this city ever since.
"300 years ago, this was a stretch of empty marshland on the northwestern edge of Russia, between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland. It was here that Peter the Great sketched his Symphony of a City, which his successors, Catherine the Great and the Tsars of the Romanov dynasty, orchestrated with colonnaded palaces, classical statuary, golden-spired churches and arched bridges.
Peter the Great famously said he wanted his new capital city to be a window on the West, flooding benighted Russia with the illumination of Western modernity. But a window looks both ways. St. Petersburg offered the West a vista on the cultural riches of Mother Russia, from Crime and Punishment to Swan Lake.
But always alongside the culture were the politics. Politics of a particularly lethal kind. This was a city of the proletariat as well as the intelligentsia, an industrial city of docklands and factories, slums and dives, poverty and unrest, which would ultimately explode into revolution. Following a succession of defeats on the Eastern Front during the First World War, Tsar Nicholas was deposed in 1917. And in the chaos that ensued, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power in a coup d'etat. Civil war, famine, and the painful birth of the new Soviet system followed, during which, by some estimates, as many as 15 million perished. When Lenin died in 1924, Moscow got his embalmed corpse. This place was left with his name, becoming Leningrad the same year. It proved to be a bad bargain. Lenin's successor was Joseph Stalin. He mistrusted Leningrad. Ethnically diverse, culturally self-confident, and politically independent, the city was a challenge to his autocratic instincts.
And so once Stalin had consolidated his grip on power, Leningrad got it in the neck. The back of the neck.
In 1936, Stalin unleashed his Great Terror. Violent political repression had been a constant in Russian history, but in intensity and scale there had been nothing to match the mass arrests, show trials and mass executions of Stalin's terror, inflicted across the Soviet Union. In Leningrad, Black Marias would fan out from the secret police headquarters, the Bolshoi Dom, the big house, night after night, to harvest fresh crops of victims. Tens of thousands were sent to the labour camps of the Gulag. The rest ended up here. This small forest 18 miles north of Leningrad is known as the Levashovo Wasteland. This is where the bodies of those shot by the secret police were dumped. Today, family members mark the memory of loved ones by placing photographs on the trees that share the ground with their bodies. Between the autumn of 1936 and the summer of 1938, around 68,000 Leningraders were murdered in this way. Their names recorded in 13 volumes of the Leningrad Martyrology. Across the Soviet Union, there were, by the most conservative estimates, 1.5 million arrests, and at least 700,000 executions.
Death on such a scale is almost impossible to comprehend. But as Stalin remarked, one death, that's a tragedy. 1 million deaths, it's a statistic.
During the Great Terror, the composer Dmitri Shostakovich, like everyone else, walked a tightrope. A native of Leningrad, he was a prodigy of the city's celebrated conservatory. And while still a teenager, he won international fame with his first symphony and established his claim to be the leading composer of the Soviet era. But status brought no immunity from Stalin's terror. Far more helpful to Shostakovich was the Song of the Counterplan, which he'd written for a hit movie in 1932 and which was said to be one of Stalin's favourites. In Stalin's Russia, that kind of popularity could save your life. With its refrain like a fixed grin, the Song of the Counterplan expresses the profound optimism now demanded of Soviet composers. As Stalin himself said, life is getting better, comrades. Life is becoming more joyous. The Soviet system was totalitarian. It concerned itself with everything a citizen did. Mining coal to writing poetry, everything was the business of the state. But when it came to music, the cultural commissars were conflicted. They sensed that music could be a useful tool, but could it be trusted to toe the party line? Vladimir Ilyich Lenin loved Beethoven, but that very passion troubled him, because what if his love for the Appassionata Sonata were to sap his revolutionary zeal? I can't listen to music very often. It affects my nerves, Lenin complained. It makes one want to say silly things and to pat people on their little heads, people who can create such beauty living in a filthy hell. But one shouldn't pat anyone on their little heads nowadays. One should beat them mercilessly. Not that we want to use that kind of violence against anyone, ideally. But our duty is infernally hard. Under Stalin, the machinery of totalitarianism had fallen into the hands of a tyrant. Now everything was his business. Like Lenin, Stalin was a music buff, scribbling terse judgments on the sleeves of his record collection. Good, bad, so-so. And when the secret police delivered long lists of names to his desk, he annotated them in the same brisk style. Beat, beat, and beat again. Shoot them all. But at a time when the pressure to conform weighed like a mountain on the artistic life of the Soviet Union, Shostakovich dared to break free. 2 years after The Song of the Counterplan, Shostakovich premiered a new opera, Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district, a grisly tale of greed, lust and murder, with sexually charged music that combined extremes of expressionism with radical dissonance. By choosing a story set in the bad old days of the Tsars, Shostakovich must have felt that he'd done enough to be politically correct. But when Stalin finally caught up with the opera 2 years after its premiere, the composer's high-flying career came crashing down to earth. At a performance at the Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow on the 26th of January 1936, Stalin walked out after the first act. This is an article that no Soviet composer in the days of Stalin wanted to read, especially when it was rumoured to have been written by the great record collector himself. It was published in Pravda 2 days after Stalin's dramatic walkout, and its title, Sumbur vmesto muziki, muddle instead of music, sets the tone for what follows. From the first minute, the listener is shocked by deliberate dissonance, by a confused stream of sound. Snatches of melody, the beginnings of a musical phrase, are drowned, emerge again, and disappear in a grinding and squealing roar. And it gets worse. To follow this music is most difficult. To remember it, impossible. It is a game of clever ingenuity that may end very badly. Maxim Shostakovich, who as a conductor would work closely with his father, saw as a child the crushing effects of Stalin's disfavor.
Сталину он считал, что все музыканты, артисты должны быть как такие, знаешь, puppets, это управляемые марионетки такие. Вот. И, конечно, это привело к тому, что вот это после этого все произведения его были запрещены, и жизнь его очень усложнилась. Прежние друзья, которые называли себя его друзьями, знаете, они переходили на другую сторону улицы, когда они его встречали, потому что они знали, что это практически человек вне закона. Шостакович стал.
The following year, 1937, things took an even more sinister turn. Marshal Tukhachevsky, a friend and supporter of Shostakovich, fell foul of Stalin's paranoid suspicions. The composer was ordered to report to the Bolshoi Dom confession factory, where he was questioned about a plot to assassinate Stalin, supposedly hatched at Tukhachevsky's dacha. When he failed to supply the answers required, his interrogator asked him to think carefully about it overnight and to return the next day with something more incriminating.
На следующий день он, уже попрощавшись с моей матерью, понимая, что ему грозит ГУЛАГ, а может быть даже и расстрел, он пришел к кабинету этого следователя, там был какой-то кабинет. Он сидит час, два ждет, никого нет, никак. Наконец, когда прошло, может, очень много, может, часа 3-4 он ждал около этого кабинета. И проходит какой-то человек, какой-то там мелкий работник, и спрашивает, вот вы, говорит, здесь сидите, уже столько времени ждете, вы кого ждете? Он говорит, я жду вот этого такого-то человека из этого кабинета. А, говорит, этого человека уже нет, он уже расстрелян, и его же больше нет. Так что можете идти домой. Пошел домой, это вот так вот этим дело кончится. А так это могло очень даже серьезно кончиться.
And then war came to Leningrad, and a new kind of terror gripped the city. For the the Soviet Union, the German invasion on the 22nd of June 1941 was swift and shocking. Less than 2 years earlier, the Nazis and the Soviets had alarmed the world by signing a non-aggression pact. And at first, Stalin simply refused to believe that Hitler had broken it. The scale of the onslaught soon became clear, with German panzer divisions storming across an 1,800-mile front deep into Soviet territory, east towards Moscow, southeast into the Ukraine, and northeast through the Baltic states towards Leningrad. Perched on the northwestern edge of Soviet territory, Leningrad was especially vulnerable to the German advance, coupled with a blocking move from the Soviets' old enemy, the Finns. As the Red Army fell back, the city on its neck of land between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga was very soon in danger of being cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. On the 8th of September 1941, the encirclement was complete. Hitler ordered his generals to halt their advance, to hold their positions, and to starve the city to death. Hitler loathed Leningrad. When Paris fell in the summer of 1940, he came to gloat, but the sight of the French capital inspired a grudging respect. For Leningrad, he had no respect. To him, it was a city of subhuman Untermensch. Slavs, Bolsheviks, Jews. Their city could be destroyed, and in the cruelest way imaginable. Deliberate, slow starvation. Rationing had been introduced in Leningrad in July. To begin with, the ration levels were generous, workers receiving double the amount given to so-called dependents, women, children, the elderly. But once the siege began in earnest, the ration quickly fell, and for dependents, the fall was acute. From 400 grams a day in July 1941 to just 125 in November. Less than 20% of the calories needed to survive. This is what 125 grams of bread would have looked like. It's pitiful, but this was the daily ration for dependents during one of the coldest winters ever known. This is good quality bread, made from lovely fragrant flour. During the siege, bread was adulterated with all sorts: pine shavings, animal fodder, the sweepings off the bakery floor. It came out looking and tasting like a lump of damp clay. Yet, to a city ravaged by hunger, this was the most precious thing on earth. The Soviet ration system was based on principles originally developed in the Gulag, where food was distributed not according to need, but according to your capacity for work. But keeping a family alive did not count as work. The work of sheer survival fell mostly to mothers. Getting up at dawn, cold and famished, summoning the energy to get out and join a bread queue, and then to stand there for hours in bitter cold, exposed to artillery and bombs, and all for a meagre ration of adulterated bread.
So what use is a composer to a city under siege? What kind of work should he do? Turned down for active service, Shostakovich dug trenches before being assigned to fire-watching duties on the roof of the conservatory. A perfect photo opportunity that produced an image that would later come to define the siege. Firefighter Shostakovich composing despite the bombs and the shells. And like all the best propaganda, it was true. On the 19th of July, just a few days after the fall of the Russian city of Smolensk, he began work on a new composition. A symphony, his 7th, in 4 movements. Composers have often attempted to capture or commemorate moments of war. Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. But as musicologist Marina Frolova-Walker explains, none have done that in the heat of battle.
This is what is so unique about it, because when the war started, Shostakovich was the only one who actually started writing a symphony pretty soon after that. And usually we say that, time needs to pass for thoughts, to be sort of packaged in symphonic form. But Shostakovich managed to do it at that time, and I don't know anyone else who managed to do that.
The most obvious place where that happens, most famously in the first movement, is what has become called the invasion theme, which starts with the side drum, takes over the whole orchestra, and seems almost to destroy everything in its path, musically speaking. I mean, look, here it is here, starting with the side drums. We might give this a go. So it goes on, the same inane little tune, repeating and repeating a dozen times, building and building, pianissimo to fortissimo, for more than 340 bars.
I think what he does is very original, and I know lots of critics says that it is not. Yeah, and they said this is like Ravel's Bolero.
Because of the repetitions.
Yeah, because of the repetition. And yet I think what is absolutely unique about this is that war has never been portrayed in this way, in this grotesque way. So what Shostakovich seems to say, that any banal, ordinary thing can become so terrifying and so evil. Neither Hitler nor Stalin, nor anyone else, they were not so particularly so evil geniuses. They were ordinary people. One was a mediocre painter, another one is a mediocre poet, and look what happens.
Shostakovich was able to complete 2 more movements of the symphony in Leningrad. But at the beginning of October, as the military situation deteriorated, he was airlifted out of the city with the 4th and final movement incomplete.
Дети, мы знаем, и я знаю, что мы сейчас полетим на самолете из Петербурга. Вот. И я говорю: папа, а что если немец нас сейчас как трахнет? И тут я первый раз сказал букву «Р».
For those left behind in the besieged city, October marked the start of what became known as the Starvation Winter. It was the coldest anyone could remember. The first snows fell early that year in mid-October, and after that temperatures plummeted, reaching record lows of minus 35 degrees centigrade. The Arctic temperatures froze the waters of Lake Ladoga, allowing a few supplies to reach the city by truck at great hazard across the so-called ice road. But even with this fragile lifeline, hunger soon began to bite. Cats and dogs quickly disappeared from the streets, victims of a new kind of siege cuisine, in which fresh meat, whatever its source, became a luxury. As for the rest, a typical siege menu consisted of rissoles made of mustard and carpenter's glue, and soup made from boiled leather belts. Throughout the siege, the city was under threat from artillery and air raids. But Leningrad was not blitzed to the ground. For most, death would not be sudden and violent, but slow and agonizing. By November, the first deaths from malnutrition were being reported. The authorities insisted on the use of the word dystrophy, a euphemism that failed to obscure a terrible truth. Leningrad was starving.
This is a very compelling, shocking photograph. On the face of it, it looks like a bent old woman hauling her son. But it's perfectly possible that they were husband and wife. The effect of malnutrition was horribly, horribly aging. Women in particular look 20 to 30 years older than their real age. But also, this young man is not as well fed as he appears. He's actually swollen with edema. It's one of the last stages of starvation. And also he has the swarthy look from skin discoloration, which is one of the symptoms of starvation. What, with black humour, came to be dubbed a siege tan. By December, the first mummies have appeared, corpses of loved ones wrapped in fabric to be taken to improvised graves. People couldn't afford to give up wood for proper coffins. What a tragic, tragic picture. This is a photograph from Orphanage 38. Orphanage staff reported dying mothers using the very last of their strength to carry their babies and small children to the orphanage, to leave them there and then to go home to die.
Life in the besieged city came to be measured out by the ticks of a metronome. It was broadcast on Radio Leningrad in the breaks between programs and was meant to show that the city still lived. This was the soundtrack of the siege, at least until the symphony appeared. It became a truism of the times that everyone had their own siege.
Спасибо большое, спасибо. Ага. О, какие привет, розы. Я люблю цветы. Ага, очаровательно. Батюшки уже что-то снимают. Господи, без предупреждения.
The memories of 91-year-old Olga Kavade remain pin-sharp.
Olga, how old were you when the siege began and what were you doing?
17 было. А 18 мне исполнилось в январе, 26 января 42 года. И я 5 часов стояла в очереди, чтобы получить по карточке вот эту маленькую порцию хлеба. Был холод, мороз был почти 30 градусов, это январь 42-го. И вот думала, как я мечтала о том, что я буду встречать 18 лет. И вот я в результате стояла. Я только что похоронила отца и деда. Папа умер в январе 8-го, дедушка 21-го. И вот дед умер, они прочитали над ним молитвы, которые полагается, завернули его в старую портьеру, спустили вниз все вместе, и я на саночках деда повезла в том морг. Это простить трудно. Вот так. А дед был глава семьи, вокруг него все, его все очень любили. Ну ладно, поехали дальше. Я во время блокады работала в детском доме. А наверху это были замечательные комнаты, залы. И я решила пройти по залам. Солнце яркое, красивые эти изразцовые у нас эти печи, зеркала, и, в общем, красиво. И стоит елка. И я обратила внимание, что под елкой какие-то пакеты. А оказалось, когда я подошла ближе, я поняла, что это умершие дети, завернутые в простынку. Потому что умирали, и надо было куда-то их относить. А там же не топили, там холод был, там те же 25 градусов. И вот лежали несколько таких. И вот это тоже на всю жизнь я помню это. Елку, и под ней умершие дети, завернутые в простынку. И этого нельзя простить.
Far away from the suffering city, Shostakovich struggled to complete the 7th Symphony. Evacuated to Moscow, he and his family soon had to flee from there too, as the Germans continued their inexorable advance. Along with thousands of other refugees, they travelled by train hundreds of miles east. After a chaotic 7-day journey, during which the score of the 7th was nearly lost forever, they ended up in Kuibyshev, the Soviet Union's provisional wartime capital on the banks of the Volga River. It was in this overcrowded city of refugees, in cramped, noisy accommodation, that Shostakovich tried to find a fitting resolution to his epic work. A musical victory that he hoped would inspire the ultimate military victory.
But how do you write out musically victory when victory is not in sight? Because quite a lot of people thought at this time the war was lost. It was such a huge, devastating moment. So, so there wasn't even a chink of light at the end of the tunnel. And the torment is in that finale. I think the torment of him trying to write this finale, but also the torment that people are going on the way this victory. Somehow this, again, it coincides, you know, the compositional process coincides with the war. People can say you can't read all this into music, but this is what happens with music which is programmatic.
So it's telling a story.
Yes, and he has to get through gradually, literally semitone by semitone. He moves up another page of music, and then he moves another semitone up, and then another page. So it's going painstakingly slowly. But then when it finally comes, yeah, then there's this sense of elation. He must have been very pleased with himself. You know, he usually was when he wrote something good.
Моя седьмая симфония навеяна грозными событиями 1941 года. Нашей борьбе с фашизмом, нашей грядущей победе над врагом, моему родному городу Ленинграду я посвящаю это сочинение. Сейчас я сыграю отрывок из первой части седьмой симфонии.
In Leningrad, the metronome ticked on, but it was beginning to sound like a death rattle rather than a heartbeat. The musical life of the city, a vital boost to morale throughout the summer and autumn, had continued with concerts and broadcasts right up until the end of December 1941. But now, as the new year began, the city's one remaining orchestra, the Radiocom, based at the Radio House, was near collapse. A stark memo from the Time reads: leader, first violins, dead. Bassoon, near death. Senior percussionist, dead. But it was in the snow-choked courtyards, frozen stairwells and cramped rooms of the city's communal apartment blocks that the daily grind of survival was at its most implacable. In this painstakingly reconstructed siege room, you can sense the claustrophobic atmosphere of a domestic nightmare. It was a world in which mundane objects took on huge significance. A homemade oil lamp, nicknamed a smoker, that gave off more fumes than light. The speaker, wired to Radio Leningrad for when the electricity was working. The child's sledge, the Sankey, now used to haul wood, water, and corpses. An improvised stove fed with scraps of anything that would burn. As siege survivor Tamara Karolkiewicz recalls.
Значит, топили мы сначала, мы сожгли кухонный стол. Деревянный большой был кухонный стол. Потом мы жгли красное дерево, потом черное дерево. Потом мы жгли все то, что горело. Бумаги, книги. Ну, жгли все, чтобы, потому что если закрывалась эта печка, там у меня было выбора. Или умереть, или греться как-то было. Мы же на улице же нет леса.
During the dead days of December, January and February, when it was dark for 18 out of 24 hours, any time not spent queuing for bread or scrounging for wood was spent daydreaming about food, reading, and for some, writing a diary. One of the most revealing of these siege diaries was written by Elena Kachina, a scientist whose observations have the calm objectivity of her profession.
Just before the Germans closed around the city, Elena's laboratory was evacuated and she had the chance to leave, but she delayed because her baby daughter Lena had a slight fever. It was a fateful decision. A few days later, Leningrad was cut off.
Elena, the baby, and her husband Dima were trapped. And when the starvation winter came, the bonds of love within this little family were strained to breaking point.
Elena kept her baby alive on millet porridge, eked out from a small supply she had managed to stockpile at the very start of the siege. But one day, she discovers that her husband Dima has been stealing it.
26th of November. Today, when I unexpectedly came into the room, I found Dima hurriedly chewing the millet. "Don't you dare eat it," I yelled, losing control of myself. "Shut up, I can't help myself." His eyes looked at me with despair. I shut up and my anger passed. I began to pity him. I now take the millet with me when I leave the house. Dima is angry at me, but he keeps quiet. 13th of December. Lena is sick. Dima doesn't help me anymore. He doesn't even play with Lena. He only goes willingly to the bread store for our rations. He's probably eating bits of it on the way back home. 6th of January. Lice torment both of us a lot. We sleep together. There's only one bed in the room. But even through padded coats, it's unpleasant for us to feel one another's touch. We've never been as remote from one another. Each of us struggles silently with our own suffering. 10th of January. Lena has forgotten how to talk. She's no longer able to stand or even to sit up. Her skin hangs in creases. She sings quietly all the time. Evidently she's begging to eat. I kissed her eyes, the eyes of a hungry little wolf. "You're doing that on purpose," Dima said. "You're purposely caressing Lena. You want to torment me." 12th of January. I took Lena to the clinic. Waiting for the doctor, I put her on the table. "Don't leave that child unattended," a nurse whispered. "We've had cases of children being kidnapped." Kidnapped, she means, for food, by cannibals.
Throughout the starvation winter, rumours of cannibalism were rife in the city. In the bread queues, people whispered about gangs who snatched babies or lured victims to abandoned apartments where they were murdered, butchered, and their body parts eaten or sold. After the war, cannibalism became one of the siege's greatest taboos, a grisly legend, officially denied but never entirely repressed. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet system that researchers were able to assess the hard evidence documented in the files of the secret police. What they discovered were not marauding gangs of baby-snatching murderers, but for the most part, desperate women, new to the city, without resources, work or connections, sometimes even without ration cards. Some scavenged flesh from the corpses that lay in the streets. Others, in the most extreme cases, murdered one of their own children to feed the rest. These eyewitness scenes, painted during the siege by artist Mikhail Georgievich, capture the frenzy of hunger that drove some Leningraders to prey on their neighbours. Nevertheless, in spite of terrible privation, order in the starving city never broke down.
By early February 1942, in Kuibyshev, the 7th Symphony was being rehearsed by the Bolshoi Theatre Orchestra, which had been evacuated from Moscow along with foreign embassies and the political and bureaucratic machinery of the Soviet government. Shostakovich, himself a refugee, attended the run-through of the first two movements, and as he later wrote, "For half a day I rejoiced over my baby."
Какие ноты у кларнета? Первые вот эти тера, тера, а потом на полтоновой выше пе-ла-ла-ла-лам. Та-та-та-та-там, та-е-та-та-та-та-та-та-там.
The conductor, Samuel Samasud, evidently felt there was still room for improvement, and he tried to persuade Shostakovich to rewrite the finale to include chorus and soloists with a text in praise of Stalin. With characteristic evasiveness, Shostakovich thanked him for his valuable remarks, which, as he later confided to a friend, I take into consideration, but not into practice.
The world premiere of Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, dedicated by the composer to the city of Leningrad, took place on the 5th of March 1942 in the Kuibyshev Opera House. Yosef Raiskin, a 6-year-old evacuee from Leningrad, was in the audience.
Вы знаете, я, конечно, был предупрежден старшими о том, что я должен вести себя, так сказать, смирно, тихо. Я боялся пошевелиться. Но, конечно, вы знаете, настроение, атмосфера в зале была поразительная. Это не могло не настроить даже ребенка. Но, знаете, эта музыка, с одной стороны, я видел, как она зал придавливает, и в то же самое время и возносит тоже. Я видел, как люди улыбались сквозь слезы. И я понял, что музыка вот для этого и создана. Вот это поразительное ощущение ужаса, особенно в первой части, после замечательного этого домажорного вступления, широких таких богатырских тем, чисто русских, когда появляется это змеиное шествие, крысиное, как его называли многие, это ужасно действует. А потом, когда этот марш обрастает железом и кровью,
ночью, когда уже я после этой премьеры, я никак не мог заснуть, потому что вот это издалека вот этот маленький барабанчик, который изображал вот придвигающихся вот этих страшных фашистов, так все громче, 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 громче. Я начинал кричать. Было очень страшно. Это было ужасно.
Что я могу сказать? Аудитория была удивительно благодарной, при том, что музыка эта кажется не самой популярной, но тем не менее она была воспринята залом замечательно. Я помню, что выходил какой-то не очень высокого роста человек в очках, кланялся. Мне сказали, что это и есть Шостакович. Нельзя было не оценить, конечно, этого контраста. Человек скромный, на поклонах он сгибался пополам, ну, прямо как паяц. И, конечно, контраст между той грандиозной бурей звуков, которые он вызывал своей рукой, написавший все это, и вот его обликом, таким простым и, в общем, достаточно скромным.
Это вообще музыка Шостаковича, это о человеке, это его о человеческом, так сказать, вообще это его, он защищает человека своей музыкой. Вот. От этой страшной машины насилия, смерти, убийства.
Later that March, the Leningrad Symphony was performed in Moscow. As Shostakovich took his customary sheepish bow, one observer commented, "This man is now more powerful than Hitler." Shostakovich would move to Moscow, where he'd remain for the rest of the war. But his Seventh Symphony was about to begin a remarkable odyssey across a war-torn world. Photographed on 900 pages of microfilm, the score was put on a secret flight out of Moscow to Tehran, then overland to Cairo and on to London, and a sandbag building in Portland Place, which itself was no stranger to the deprivations of war.
This is the BBC Home Service. Many of you will already know that the length of the Shostakovich...
The arrival of the Leningrad Symphony at the BBC caused consternation. They'd heard rumours that it was big, but no one realised just how big until the microfilm pages had been turned into a score. At his first rehearsal at the Maida Vale studio, conductor Sir Henry Wood timed the symphony at 78.5 minutes, which meant that when broadcast, it would overrun the sacred chimes of Big Ben at 9 o'clock. As this internal BBC memo reveals, the presentation editor, Mr. Phillips, suggested tentatively that the symphony be broken between the third and fourth movements to accommodate the 9 o'clock news bulletin. Well, in the end, wiser deputy heads prevailed, and it was decided that the symphony could indeed go ahead uninterrupted. And as for the chimes of Big Ben, well, they just have to wait.
It is fitting that this work should receive its first performance in this country on the anniversary of Germany's treacherous attack on Russia. It was written in the besieged fortress of Leningrad, and the last movement interprets the faith and aspirations of Russia crystallized in its title, Vickery.
On the night, Sir Henry Wood stormed through the Seventh in just 70 minutes, causing yet more panic at Broadcasting House when the performance ended 4 minutes shy of 9 o'clock. But Mr. Phillips in Prez vamped valiantly until the chimes of Big Ben were ready. And the Beeb, in the words of the Director General, came through in flying colours. While the BBC patted itself on the back, the Seventh's journey continued via South America to New York, where star conductors Serge Koussevitzky, Leopold Stokowski and Arturo Toscanini fought politely but determinedly for the privilege of premiering the work. In the end, Toscanini pulled rank. As a veteran anti-fascist and publicly sworn enemy of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, he secured the gig for his NBC Symphony Orchestra. And so, in the same week that the staunchly anti-Soviet Time magazine ran a cover story on the heroism and creative genius of fireman Shostakovich, NBC informed its audience that Red Russia was now America's doughty ally in the battle for freedom. And the proof was the Leningrad Symphony.
A musical work descriptive not only of the horrors of Nazi fascism, but of the indomitable will of a fighting people to crush this monster and win through to final victory and freedom for all men.
Within just a year, the Leningrad Symphony had been performed nearly 100 times, an unprecedented performance history for a new work. There was, though, one place where it had yet to be performed, the city where, of course, it meant most of all.
In besieged Leningrad, spring was on its way at last. With a population savagely depleted by 500,000 deaths, there was at least more food for the survivors, and the ration was increased. Even the trams were running again. When people heard their bells ringing once more, they greeted them like old friends, with tears in their eyes. But though the city was emerging from its frozen immobility, survivors were sick and exhausted. Unable to generate enough warmth from their emaciated bodies, they dressed in thick layers, even in the early spring sunshine. And though their bodies remained cold, their emotions were coming out of deep freeze. Anyone who had come through the starvation winter had a lot to come to terms with. The heart-rending losses they had endured, the unimaginable things they had witnessed, and for some, the unthinkable things that they had done. So what had happened to Elena, Dima, and baby Lena? Somehow all three survived, through a mixture of sheer luck and outright theft. Once Dima had perfected a method of stealing loaves of bread using a sharpened walking stick. In her diary, Elena allows herself few illusions about what hunger can do to a person. Heroism, self-sacrifice, the heroic feat. Only those who are full or haven't been hungry long are capable of these. As for us, we came to know a hunger that degraded and crushed us, that turned us into animals. May those who come after us and happen to read these lines have mercy upon us. As the thaw set in, the city authorities dragooned Leningraders into a clean-up operation. Teams of women were ordered to remove tons of yellow snow, encrusted with months of accumulated human filth. And as the weather improved, the planting of vegetables became a top priority. And some Leningraders discovered their green fingers.
И вот эту посеяли свеклу. Вот такая была свекла. И вот такие сорняки. И вот надо было полоть. День полола, два полола. И у меня руки были темно-зелеными. Страшные зеленые, как у лягушки.
But it would take more than cabbages and a clean-up to restore the city's shattered morale. At some point, a party apparatchik called up the radio house and told them to take the bloody metronome off the air. What the city needed was music, and not just recorded music. As a matter of the highest urgency, the radio house was ordered to bring its orchestra back from the dead.
In the whole of Leningrad, there was only one conductor now left alive, Karl Eliasberg. On the 1st of March, he was summoned by the Radio House Committee and ordered to resume orchestral performances immediately.
By this stage, only 27 musicians were left, only 12 of whom were even capable of playing their instruments. So an appeal was broadcast, asking all musicians to report immediately to the radio house. Enticed by the prospect of extra rations, many turned up, some with little or in fact no musical experience whatsoever. Once Eliasberg had weeded them out, he found he was still well short of the numbers required. So, on a bicycle, requisitioned by the radio committee, he set out in search of musicians who, as the expression went, had fallen down the funnel.
There are many legends surrounding Eliasberg and his extraordinary quest for musicians in the stricken city of Leningrad. But none can top the story of the drummer, Jaudat Aydarov.
Eliasberg had been told that Aydarov had died. He went to the morgue and discovered the body, and he saw that the fingers of this supposed corpse were twitching. "He's alive," shouted Eliasberg, and before long, Aydarov was at the radio house being nursed back to health on extra rations.
I'm told that this is the very side drum that Aydarov used for the Leningrad Symphony when it was finally performed in Leningrad. And eyewitnesses said that he hammered out the invasion rhythm in the first movement with such ferocity, with such hatred, that it wasn't as if this was a musical instrument, but a fascist's helmet. Bringing half-dead musicians back to life was just the start. Eliasberg's next miracle was to mould them into a working orchestra. By necessity, they were a mixed bunch, but they had one thing in common. All were veterans of the siege, with the experiences and the scars to show for it. Tuba player Alexander Shatovsky was a frontline soldier who lost his wife and son during the siege. Viola player Isaac Yazleniavsky extinguished incendiaries that rained down from Luftwaffe bombers. Flautist Galina Yersheva worked in a munitions factory and performed for soldiers on the front line. Cellist Andrei Safonov scaled the golden spires of city landmarks to camouflage them with canvas and grey paint. And student Zhenya Matus was asked to pay for the repair of her oboe with a tasty dead cat. Viktor Kozlov, a clarinetist who played under the conductor after the war and later wrote his biography, explains how Eliasberg turned these survivors into an orchestra.
Но, говоря о качествах Элиасберга, необходимо сказать, что все свои требования он начинал всегда с себя. Несмотря на то, что первые концерты оркестр играл, кутаясь во все, что угодно, потому что было очень холодно в залах, Элиасберг выходил во фраке и в белоснежные манишки. Он не позволял себе отойти от даже вот такого внешнего образа культуры. Но никогда он не повышал голос, безошибочной позиции дирижера. Он никогда не говорил впустую, никогда не мучил никого повторениями, потому что он знал, что он хочет слышать, и зачастую даже руками объяснял, что он хочет.
The first rehearsal of the reconstituted Radiocom Orchestra was attended by just 14 musicians. Some were so weak they couldn't climb the stairs to the rehearsal room on the first floor, so they remained downstairs and listened while their stronger colleagues played.
Есть такая знаменитая формула, когда говорят «пушки, музы молчат». По всем социальным событиям, происходящим в годы войны, оркестр не должен был работать. Это на самом деле выглядело как победа духа над оружием.
Leningrad had got its orchestra back. Now what it needed was its symphony. Aware of the huge propaganda value the symphony had built during its world tour, party bosses in Leningrad ordered the radio committee to get hold of a copy of the score and get it into the city as soon as possible. On the 2nd of July, after a perilous flight, an aircraft landed in the city with a load of vital medical supplies and the score of the 7th in its hold. The Leningrad Symphony had come home.
And this is it. The full conductor's score in 4 volumes, delivered like some kind of secret weapon to the besieged city.
And this is the very score that had been used at the Kuibyshev premiere.
Now, when Eliasberg opened this score for the very first time, his reaction was simply to say, this is impossible. I mean, look at the demands that Shostakovich is placing on his orchestra here. Eliasberg could see there were 115 musicians used for that premiere. 8 horns, 6 trumpets, 6 trombones. This is a piece that makes superhuman demands on any orchestra. And you know, Shostakovich's 7th may be many things, but a symphony written for half-starved musicians to play, it sure ain't.
Никогда так не выходишь с концерта, как вот после 7-й симфонии, именно совсем выжатый, как лимон.
Ну, она, конечно, поражает, во-первых, своей грандиозностью по масштабам. «Войну и мир» Толстого. Вот такой вот.
Понять, как это происходило, то понять это невозможно. Это был один из тех величайших подвигов, которые совершил весь советский народ во время войны. Одни кидались под танки с гранатой, а другие шли с инструментами голодные в холодный зал, обессиленные, и играли симфонию Шостаковича.
Нежели бойцы на передовой. У каждого была своя передовая. У них она была здесь, в этом зале.
Пришла домой. Ну, а тетка говорит, и вот будет концерт в филармонии. Боже мой, филармонии. Даже было в голове, не могло быть.
Это была страшная зима. Люди, растерялись многие. И вдруг музыка.
А у меня руки темно-зеленые, страшные. Господи, Боже мой. Я боялась идти, потому что стыдно. А филармония — это для меня, как-то самое высокое, самое святое.
The first performance of the Leningrad Symphony in Leningrad was announced for the 9th of August 1942. Before the concert began, one last instrument, not specified by Shostakovich, was added to the score. A massive Soviet barrage targeting German artillery positions and designed to ensure that the performance was not interrupted.
And so the stage was set for the Radiocom Orchestra, conductor Karl Eliasberg, and for Dmitri Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony, in front of an audience of more than 1,000. No recording of the concert has survived, no film, not even a photograph. Nothing remains of the August the 9th performance, except for the memories of those who were there. But these are indelible.
И вот я вошла в зал, он такой же, все то же самое, все висят люстры. Такое странное такое чувство. С одной стороны, это не может быть, блокада, похороны, смерти, голод и филармония. Вы знаете, как-то это все очень было непонятно.
Вообще в голове еще такие появились мысли, что мы уже шли на музыку, понимаете, это было заложено в человеке, потому что в основном думали о хлебе.
Мы только боялись, что будет, они начнут бомбить. Думаю, Господи, не дай Бог, не дадут нам дослушать. Ну, а потом вышел Элиасберг, стал оркестр. И вот они играют. А кто не голодал, то все голодали. Ну, они были все, как полагается, с бантиками все. Но, конечно, толстяков не было, я так думаю. И Асберг тоже был. Вообще все были. Модно было быть худым. Почему-то мне сразу папа. Папа любил хорошую музыку, сам играл, и меня приучали к этому. И вот я вспомнила, что как папа меня водил в филармонию, и думаю, он как-то это слышал.
Ну, что сказать о музыке. Музыка может сказать о себе, так сказать, лучше, чем человек. Конечно, это я все уже поняла, что он так талантливо описал эти сапоги немецкие, не немецкие, конечно, а фашистские, и вот этот вход, звериный вход, и вся вот эта вот обстановка. А потом какой-то просвет, какой-то луч, который дал надежду. Что она была исполнена именно в это время, и она была исполнена в то время, когда люди уже пали духом, они уже не знали, как подняться. И когда они выходили, что они уже получили такой заряд.
В последней части очень много еще отголосков борьбы. Она не завершена в предыдущих частях. Она продолжается, и как раз грандиозная битва развертывается в последней части. Финал ее – это ликующее проведение опять этой до-мажорной темы в конце. Эта симфония, конечно, победа.
это, с одной стороны, как бы сказать, их и плакать хотелось, и в то же время была какая-то гордость. Вот черт возьми, а у нас оркестр, а мы в филармонии, и сидите вы там. Хотя это смешно, кругом немцы нас постреляют, а в то же время вот какое-то чувство превосходства.
Вы знаете, я думаю иногда, что пророки писали словами, а великие композиторы, они тоже пророки, они писали звуками, музыкой. И в этой симфонии удивительное пророчество победы. Это просто представить себе невозможно, что тогда, когда это писалось, то не было даже никакой надежды на спасение от фашистских орд, что все это будет разрушено, убито, потонет в крови. И вот он пишет вот это пророчество. И это пророчество сбылось. Была одержана победа. Огромной ценой, но победа.
Говорит Ленинград.
Говорит город Ленина.
Внимание, товарищи! В итоге 12-дневных напряженных боев прорвали и преодолели на всем фронте под Ленинградом решена задача исторической важности. Город Ленинград полностью освобожден от вражеской блокады и от варварских артиллерийских обстрелов противника.
It took more than a concert to break the siege of Leningrad. The city had another 531 days of suffering to endure before the German lines were finally broken on the 27th of January 1944. But after the war was over, it was discovered that the performance of the Leningrad Symphony that evening in August did play its part in the victory that followed. That night, Radio Leningrad had taken the fight directly to the enemy by broadcasting the concert on loudspeakers across the front line, a shrewd psychological blow that found its mark.
Но эту же музыку слушали немецкие войска. И немецкие офицеры тоже слушали эту музыку. Они потом признавались об этом в Лясбургу позже после войны, когда они прошли все наши лагеря. Они потом после войны признавались в Лясбургу, что это они поняли, что в этот город они не войдут. А некоторые из них просто сдавались в плен, потому что поняли, что ситуация проигрышная. То, что еще, может, не понял Гитлер, эти немецкие офицеры поняли.
No one knows for certain how many Leningraders died during the 872 days of the siege. The most recent estimates put the death toll at 500,000 soldiers and anywhere between 800,000 and 1 million civilians, making Leningrad the costliest battle in terms of casualties in modern history. In the Piskorovskaya cemetery, civilians and soldiers are buried in 186 mass graves. The inscription declares, "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." But immediately after the war, forgetting was precisely what Stalin demanded. With Nazi Germany defeated, Stalin was once again free to pursue his vendetta against Leningrad. The confession factory at the Bolshoi Dom, which had never stopped processing, even at the height of the siege, went into overdrive. City bosses, their family, friends and associates were rounded up on concocted charges, interrogated and dispatched to the Gulag, or the Levashovo wasteland.
For Shostakovich, the end of the war also meant an unwelcome return of the past. In 1948, the musical hero of Leningrad fell foul of Stalin once again. Condemned as an anti-people formalist, his work was banned. But Shostakovich couldn't be forgotten. And music written to defy one form of tyranny could be used to resist another.
Это было постановление Политбюро. Но когда в обычной школе, в средней школе, где я учился, учительница пыталась нас настроить, мой соученик, он вдруг крышкой парты стал отстукивать ритм темы нашествия из 7-й симфонии. Там-там-папам-пам, там-пам-папам-пам.
Там-там-та-та-там.
Та-ра-ра-пам.
И весь класс к нему присоединился.